So I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but not all pain is bad, right? We tend to think pain is bad, but not all pain is bad. If you've ever worked out, you know that not all pain is bad. Sometimes pain is gain, right? And I wonder if realizing that impacts the way we think about big questions like, hey, why do bad or painful things happen to good people? So why do bad things happen to good people? One of the deepest questions, one of the hardest questions, honestly, that Christians have ever asked, and we've been asking that question for thousands of years, and so just so you know, we're not going to thoroughly answer that question in a satisfying way in this format. We just don't have time for it. There have been thousands of books written, thousands of messages preached, and it's still a question that Christians wrestle with, because the idea basically is, well, if God's all good and He's all powerful, then why do bad things happen? Because if He's all good, He wouldn't want bad things to happen, and if He's all powerful, He could keep the bad things from happening, but bad things happen, and sometimes bad things seem to happen to good people. So what's wrong, right? Where does it all kind of fall apart? Listen, there's a couple of things that might be useful. There are a couple of things that are useful for me as I think about this. The first one's this: we have to be really careful about not using absolute terms to describe relative things. We have to be careful not to use absolute terms to describe relative things. See, good and bad, those are absolute terms. That thing is good, that thing is bad. It's an either or, black or white situation. But the reality is most circumstances that we face in life, especially in a world that is fallen, in a world that's been impacted by our sin, most things we face are actually relative. And so it's really hard to say, was that a purely good thing or a purely bad thing? Okay, for instance, let's imagine that a baby is born and has a very significant spinal malformity. Okay, so the spine is not working right, and the child's in a little bit of pain, or maybe they're not. Honestly, maybe they're not even in any kind of discomfort. They don't know any better. That's just the way it is. But the parents and the doctors all know that if it's not corrected, it's going to cause a significant decrease in the kind of life they're able to lead. It's going to keep them from doing all kinds of things that the parents really want their child to be able to do. And so the doctor says, hey, there's a surgery to fix this. We can do this. But it's a painful surgery. Okay, it's going to hurt the child, and then the recovery is going to be painful. The bones are going to have to remend. There's going to be incisions that have to heal. There's going to be, there's going to be stitches that have to heal. It's going to be a lot of pain. And so, from the kid's perspective, maybe the kid wasn't really feeling anything wrong, and then all of a sudden, these parents they thought were so good take them to this place, and people do terrible things to them. They cut them open and they hurt them, and then afterwards they go home. They're like, I'm in all kinds of pain. And is that a good or a bad thing? Well, it's a good thing because of what it produces, but from the child's perspective, it's a bad thing. And the reality is that sometimes we experience things, we go, well, that's bad, but what we really mean is that's painful and I didn't enjoy it. But every time I go to the gym, it's painful and I don't enjoy it, but I do like the good that comes from it. So you see what I'm saying? We have to be very careful about applying these absolute terms like good or bad to relative things, or maybe even things where it's not a matter of good or bad, it's really more of a matter of painful, or maybe it's not even what I preferred. Does that make it bad necessarily? So we got to be very careful about that. And that illustration of the child and the surgery raises another important thing to think about, and that is, I kind of think, and some people may disagree with me on this, but I kind of think that there are some good things that you can't get to without some unpleasant things, or things that we're going to perceive as bad, okay? I think there's really no such thing as a one-sided object in the world. All objects have at least two sides, and a lot of times the positive side has a negative side, it has a backside, but you couldn't have the front side if you didn't have the backside. And I'll give you an example of this. This is actually the way I often talk about this issue of the problem of evil and why did God, allow a bad thing to happen to a good person. What we need to do is we need to take it out of the realm of a specific bad thing, okay, at least of the ones that we face. So we're not necessarily going to talk about a particular car accident or a school shooting or something horrible like that. Let's go all the way back to the very first bad thing that happened, which was that Adam and Eve sinned. Okay? Now, the Bible seems to say that God knows all things, so when He created Adam and Eve, He knew they were going to sin. Now, couldn't He have created them so they didn't sin? Well, He could have created them as robots, obviously. He could have created them so they were just following programming. They didn't have the ability to make choices. But that's not what He did, and so then the question becomes, well, why not? Why didn't He create them as robots? And the answer may be that he couldn't get a good thing that he wanted without a potential bad thing. In other words, maybe what he wanted was relationship. He wanted to create beings that he was able to enter into a relationship with. And he wasn't able to create beings that he could enter into an authentic relationship with unless they also had the capacity to rebel. They had the capacity to refuse that relationship. Because if you force somebody into a relationship, it's not really a relationship, right? We have some pretty nasty words for when we force people into things they don't want to be part of. So to have a real relationship, we had to have the ability to refuse the relationship, right? And it may be that the only way for God to get what he ultimately wanted, the greatest of all possible goods, was actually to allow a bad thing to happen. And it maybe is a truly bad thing, but it's not an absolute bad thing because maybe it produces this longer term good. Here's an illustration I often use. When my kids were little, we had a stove and it had these burners on the surface, and it didn't have the coils. They would just, when you turn it on, they would glow red. It was a conduction oven, and my kids really wanted to touch those red glowing things. And of course, I didn't let them do that, but they were just attracted to them. They thought it would be kind of cool to do it. And I thought once, what would happen if they ever did touch the stove, if they touched those red parts of the stove? Well, first off, they'd have incredible pain, obviously, and that would hurt me, right? It would grieve me to see that my child had experienced that kind of pain. But then I started thinking, well, if they did that, do you think they'd ever touch the stove again? Do you think they'd ever willingly do that again? And I thought, probably not. And then I thought, wait, it's interesting. So they could probably go years and years and decades, maybe even centuries, if they lived that long, without ever touching that again on purpose, right? As long as they remembered what happened last time, they could go centuries without ever doing it again. But then I thought, but would they be able to touch it again? Like, would they have the capacity? Would they have the will to be able to touch it? The free will to be able to touch it? And I thought, well, yeah. I mean, there's nothing that would prevent them. They're no longer programmed and they're unable to touch it. There's no force field around it. They just wouldn't want to. And I thought to myself, I wonder if that's what's going on right now. I wonder if that's why God allowed Adam and Eve to sin. It was kind of like they touched the stove, and that grieves God, and he experiences the pain of his children. He ultimately took that on his own son Jesus on the cross, right? It's not just a pain that we experience. He took that pain on himself and his own son. But by allowing us to touch the stove, so to speak, what's happened? He ends up with a group of people, not everybody, because not everybody says yes. They still have the ability to say no, but he ends up with a group of people who say yes to a relationship with him. And apparently they're going to say yes to a relationship with him forever. They're never going to sin again. The Bible says there's no sin in heaven. But does that mean that they've lost their free will? That they're now robots? Well, that would defeat the whole purpose of creating human beings with free will in the first place, right? He wants that relationship. And to be able to have a relationship, you have to or have the ability to refuse the relationship. So because we've sinned and we remember what it was like to live in a world full of sin, we're going to never say no to God again. We're always going to say yes to God. We're going to say no to sin for all of eternity, but we'll still have the ability to sin. And I thought that's what God's looking for. A group of people who will say yes to him for all of eternity, even though they're able to say no, because that's the essence of real relationship. So maybe it is that the reason that so many of the bad things that we're dealing with that are so painful to us and to God, they're part of the fact that we're living in a world where we've been allowed to touch the stove because of ultimately what it's going to produce in us. And that's a deep truth. It's not an easy truth to grasp, especially when we're in the midst of pain. When something bad has happened to us or something bad has happened to somebody that we care deeply about, that philosophical understanding doesn't necessarily soften the pain of it. And I just say to you that it doesn't soften the pain of it to God either. What God's ultimately moving towards, his long-term game plan, the greatest possible good he's moving towards, like that's why he's allowing some things and allowing a world where these kinds of things still happen. But that doesn't mean that long-term gain softens the pain that he feels along the way as his children suffer. A couple of things that are useful to me as I think about this big picture question that Christians have been asking for a really long time. Well, hey, thank you for watching. So glad to have you with us today. And by the way, if you're enjoying this content, would you do a couple things for us? Number one, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any content. Number two, would love for you to like and comment on this thing. That really helps us get the word out to other people. Also, you can help us get the word out by sharing this particular post. We'd love for you to do that. And we'd love to hear from you about questions you have. There's a link in the comment section to help you tell us your difficult question, and maybe we can address that in an upcoming episode.